The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, an ongoing and deeply complex struggle, has reached alarming levels of violence, especially against Palestinian civilians. In the most recent escalations, the disproportionate aggression aimed at the impoverished Palestinian population has intensified. The targets have increasingly included the most vulnerable, innocent women, children, and entire families, leading many to question the morality, legality, and human cost of Israel's actions. In this conflict, Palestine has long endured systemic oppression and brutal military campaigns, but the current wave of violence is nothing short of catastrophic. The Israeli military's bombardments, house demolitions, and airstrikes are causing devastation on an unprecedented scale, and civilians are bearing the brunt. International observers and human rights organizations are raising alarms that what is unfolding resembles a genocide, as the loss of innocent life and the destruction of homes and livelihoods suggest an intent to erase Palestinian existence in Gaza and the West Bank. The human cost of this aggression is staggering. Reports from Gaza and other Palestinian territories paint a horrific picture. Children pulled from the rubble of their homes, schools turned to dust by airstrikes, and hospitals overwhelmed with injured civilians. According to humanitarian agencies, Palestinian children account for a large percentage of the casualties. It is not uncommon to see entire families wiped out in a single strike, leaving behind a trail of destruction and trauma. These are not just random accidents, they represent a consistent pattern of military operations that fail to distinguish between combatants and civilians. The targeting of residential areas, mosques, schools, and hospitals has transformed everyday life in Gaza into a constant nightmare. Women are particularly vulnerable, forced to watch their children die or grow up in a war zone where the basic human right to safety is absent. Many of these women have lost husbands and sons, leaving them to fend for their families alone in conditions of total devastation. Psychological trauma, too, has become an endemic part of life for Palestinian women and children, as the relentless bombings trigger profound mental health crises for those who survive. Israel's military response has repeatedly been condemned as a disproportionate use of force, despite the assertion that military operations are intended to eliminate militant groups such as Hamas. The overwhelming majority of the victims are civilians. In densely populated areas like Gaza, where civilians have no place to flee, the onslaught feels less like military engagement and more like collective punishment. Gaza has often been described as the world's largest open-air prison, with its 2 million residents living under a strict blockade that limits access to essential supplies, clean water, electricity, and medical care. When bombs rain down on these confined populations, with no escape routes, it is not hard to understand why many see this as an effort to systematically destroy the Palestinian people. This approach violates international law, which demands that civilians be protected in times of conflict. Article 147 of the Fourth Geneva Convention classifies willful killing and the extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity as war crimes. In Palestine, it is increasingly clear that these principles are being violated on a grand scale. When entire neighborhoods are obliterated, when children and women are trapped in the crossfire with no way out, it becomes difficult to view these acts as anything but deliberate. The term genocide carries heavy connotations, but it's one that is being increasingly applied to the situation in Palestine. Genocide is defined by the United Nations as actions carried out with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. While Israel defends its actions as necessary for national security, critics argue that the collective punishment of Palestinians, including the targeting of civilians and essential infrastructure, fits within this definition. Genocide is not just about mass killing, it also includes efforts to deliberately inflict conditions of life intended to destroy a group, such as depriving people of access to resources essential for survival. This is where the blockade and siege of Gaza come into focus. The blockade has strangled Gaza's economy, deprived its people of basic human needs, and created a humanitarian catastrophe. The deliberate targeting of homes, water facilities, and energy sources exacerbates the already dire living conditions, and many analysts view this as an attempt to weaken the Palestinian population to the point of collapse. The international community's reaction has been deeply divided. Some nations continue to support Israel, citing its right to defend itself against terrorism. Others have begun to voice outrage at the egregious human rights abuses being perpetrated, calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Despite widespread condemnation from human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the global powers responsible for holding Israel accountable, such as the United States and the European Union, have been slow to intervene. As the world watches, it is impossible to ignore the growing humanitarian catastrophe in Palestine. The images of terrified children, grieving mothers, and entire families torn apart are a testament to the human suffering caused by this ongoing violence. The international community faces a moral imperative to act, not only to halt the violence, but to bring about a lasting solution that respects the rights and dignity of Palestinians. This is not just a geopolitical conflict, it is a humanitarian crisis that requires immediate attention. A genocide is unfolding before our eyes, and unless the world acknowledges the scale of the suffering in Palestine, history will remember this as a moment when the global community turned a blind eye to the destruction of a people. In conclusion, the aggression of Israel towards Palestinian civilians, particularly women and children, cannot be seen as anything less than a war on a defenseless population. As the violence continues unabated, the question of genocide looms large. The international community must recognize the atrocities being committed and hold those responsible accountable, lest we witness the further erasure of an entire people.